Well, I see we have a great lineup tonight. To introduce myself, I'm David Andelman, a former president of the Overseas Press Club, and welcome to our Overseas Press Club of America book night. Tonight with Jim Laurie, author of The Last Helicopter, Two Lives in Indochina. Just one little hint, until you're called on in the Q&A session, please do keep yourself muted so we can hear all of our amazing guests and everything he has to say and offer. Jim Laurie was a friend back to my earliest days in Cambodia on my first foreign assignment for the New York Times. I was just a young tot, about 30 years old. Jim was by then quite a seasoned NBC News correspondent, but I remember him as a kind colleague to someone very much a neophyte, me, and even stayed long enough to be evacuated on the last American choppers out of Phnom Penh. I'd left the week before on the last fixed wing relief flight out of there to Bangkok. Now, thanks to his amazing new book, I found out just why he was shuttling back and forth between Phnom Penh and Saigon. And we meet a whole cast of compelling figures, especially one young Cambodian lady to whom Jim lost his heart and nearly his life. In the interim, he spent decades reporting across the world, but especially Asia, first for NBC, then for decades with ABC News, surviving all sorts of wars, revolutions, and the stuff that TV news is made of. But now, praise the Lord, he's with us all to tell us all about it. So I'll turn it over to Jim, sequestered in his vast acreage in rural Maine, where he can pick up the story. Jim.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thanks to the OPC for having me here today. I just wish we could do this in person and could have those drinks that are much promised by the OPC. That would be great. This is obviously for all of us an extraordinary year. It's the first year that I can recall that I have not had at least part of the year traveling overseas. On this day last year, I was in Haiphong, Vietnam, making my way through the country, down the coast, down south, and then across into Cambodia. And all that happened after I had spent 2.5 months in China. So it's very unusual for me to be, if you will, grounded, and very much grounded I am up here in rural Maine, but it's a great place to be. The weather's been good, and so I'm happy at least that we're all here and we're able to connect in this fashion. The book that David has alluded to is obviously a very personal memoir. In part, it's the story of a young reporter trying to find his way in a first-time war situation. I was much greener, I think, than David was when I arrived at age 22 in Cambodia. I really had just coming out of school, out of Asia studies, and I wanted to go off and see Asia. And so a lot of this book is about coming of age, if you will, in Southeast Asia. But a bigger part of it really is a tribute to a very special woman who I met in June of 1970. The story of Sok Sanan is one that I felt was very much worth preserving. And I had this obsession, which goes back more than 30 years, with sort of trying to uncover what is it about this universal and timeless question of survival? Why do under extraordinary, horrible conditions, some people survive and some do not? It came home to me also 30 years ago when I first went to Poland and visited Auschwitz and talked to a marvelous man who was a survivor of Auschwitz. And we talked about the issues of survival. Is it purely luck? Is it something else? Is it youth? And so all of these issues went into my desire to tell this tale, to tell this story of Cambodia in the early 1970s. I also wanted to try to, if I could, preserve for younger readers and students of history a first-person sense of time and place, Cambodia and Vietnam in this extraordinary period that I witnessed between 1970 and 1980. And maybe to give you a better sense of that time, I'd like to share with you a little video that I have assembled. And it just gives you a more visual sense, obviously, of what it was like in those days. When I look back at this film, which I shot, much of it 50 years ago, I marvel how crisp and clear the video that we have today is. We now have clear HD and high res. I'm going to take you back now to an era of low res and SD, a very blurry and shaky world, which was the world that we lived in 50 years ago in Cambodia and Vietnam. So I'm going to try this technology here. Bear with me while I press things like share screen and we try to go to the video. Stand by. The first thing I want to say is that the year is 1970. I'm going to lose, I think, this box here so you can pay more attention to the video itself. The year is 1970. And just to put this in context, President Nixon on April the 30th had announced a military offensive into Cambodia, which followed the overthrow of Norodom Sihanouk, who had ruled Cambodia since independence from the French in 1953. About 90,000 troops plunged across the border from Vietnam. Most of them were South Vietnamese under the command of a man who I met named Do Cao Tri, but 30 or 40,000 of them were US troops. And this was a time of my first taste of war as a combat reporter, the greenest combat reporter, I'm sure, in Cambodia, Vietnam at the time in that theater. And the incursions were the first war stories I had ever covered. So this was the beginning. And then just a short time later in June, I drove from Saigon to Phnom Penh for my first glimpse of the Cambodian capital. But my first experience was this, not a city at war at all. The city that I encountered was mostly peaceful, had an almost innocent quality about it. So far spared of war, the people I met seemed remarkably detached, and the young woman that captivated me introduced me to Khmer culture, to Khmer ballet, and other aspects of Cambodian society. The first signs of war in the city were the slow but steady buildup of war refugees fleeing North Vietnamese occupation, increasing combat, and widespread bombing. In 1970, when I arrived, Phnom Penh was a sleepy city of about 700,000 people. By early 1975, it had swollen to 1.8 million people. Within a few days in 1975, the Khmer Rouge reduced it from 1.8 million to 100,000, again within 4 days. The woman who introduced me to all of this and who sort of kept me going back and forth between Saigon and Phnom Penh was a middle-class, remarkably independent woman employed by a French agricultural firm, the daughter of a military commander in Sihanouk's army. And she was a person that was very easy to fall in love with. And as a 22-year-old, she was 21. It was pretty much love at first sight. We had less than a year together as I was drawn back to cover the war in Vietnam, got a job with NBC, and then left the region by 1973. And yet we maintained a connection over all those years. When I returned to Phnom Penh in early 1975, it was very much a different city from that which I had left in 1972. War had finally reached the city. Every day it was subjected to rocket attacks. It was being kept alive, and I think, David, you remember this, by daily American C-130 food and ammunition flights coming in from Thailand.
Vividly, and when
Khmer
Rouge wasn't,
yes.
in fact, wasn't bombing the airport, rocketing the airport.
Exactly. The country, of course, had been massively bombed. The bombing stopped in 1973 by an act of Congress, but over the period of time, there were more than 113,000 targets bombed by more than 2.5 million tons of bombs. And this had an impact, not so much an impact, interestingly, on the death toll in Cambodia, but more of an impact on the psychology. The Khmer Rouge being able to use this bombing as an instrument of propaganda to mobilize its army and, with the help of the Vietnamese, be able to build itself for their eventual victory. After 73 bombing halt, the combat went on for 2.5 years. the young Khmer military commanders who I met, the smiles disappeared as they realized by 1975 that there was very little hope in terms of a military victory. Much of the middle class, however, seemed to take a fatalistic view of the prospects of a communist victory. My friend Soksinan, she had remained in Cambodia despite numerous opportunities to leave. And I promised, if I left Cambodia, if the end came, that I would take her with me. And then the day of April the 12th came along, something called Operation Eagle Pull.
Word that the U.S. was pulling out of Cambodia came early Saturday morning. American Marines were flown in from the USS aircraft carriers Okinawa and Hancock to carry out the helicopter lift. A school several blocks from the embassy served as the makeshift landing zone.
And as I got in the helicopter, I took my little 8mm film camera and put it up to the window to see the skyline of Phnom Penh, the pagodas disappearing beneath me as we choppered out to the USS Okinawa in the Gulf of Thailand. And most distressing, of course, was that the woman that I wanted to get out did not get out. She had failed to make the last helicopter, and she began a remarkable and terrifying struggle to survive the Khmer Rouge rule and the infamous killing fields. I moved on at that point to Vietnam, and I arrived just about 4 days before the final collapse of Saigon. This is a scene, by the way, a picture that I took from the Caravel Hotel, which if any of you have been to Saigon, it's one that you will recognize immediately. Now, if I'm going to use my cursor here, and if you can see, these buildings over here have all been torn down today. They've been replaced by new modern shopping centers and apartment buildings. But the old Continental Palace Hotel is there. This was the open cafeteria, if you will, the bar, what we call the Continental Shelf. This building over to the right here is the old French Opera House, which during the South Vietnamese time was the headquarters for the National Assembly. It's now been returned to an opera house. And for those of you who are interested in the way the war was covered, this was sort of the center of war coverage in Saigon. It was 2 blocks from where the military briefings were held. The New York Times office, David, was right around here. Can you see my cursor there? And this is New York Times. This is the Eden Building, NBC, the Associated Press, all of the major news agencies that were not housed in the Caravel Hotel were housed there and had been there since the early 60s. And now we're up to 1975. I went into Vietnam with a man who I had come out of Cambodia with, a man who I'm very grateful for, a man named Neil Davis, one of the great wartime camera people, an Australian who had covered Vietnam and Cambodia going all the way back to 1963. And we sort of had a agreement. Under no conditions would we do another helicopter evacuation. We would stay in Vietnam and find out what the victory, which was inevitable, of the communists was going to be like. And we resolved not to evacuate. I think that most of us are familiar with what happened next, the incredible evacuation of Vietnam. You have, within that final month of April 1975, 130,000 people departing before the collapse of South Vietnam. More than 6,000 by helicopter from Tan Son Nhut Air Base and the U.S. Embassy, including the embassy helipad, 6,000 within 48 hours in Operation Frequent Wind, and many more thousand going down the Saigon River and by boat and being rescued by the U.S. 7th Fleet in the South China Sea. I was behind, and I was down at the bottom of the U.S. Embassy building watching the very last helicopter leave the embassy roof on the morning of April 30th. Helicopter carrying the last U.S. Marines. North Vietnamese troops and tanks were already entering the city. I took these pictures a few hours later from the Caravel Hotel as the tanks headed down to the waterfront and fanned out across the city.
NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie is one of the few Americans still left in Saigon, in the city when President Duong Van Minh went on the radio and told the Viet Cong that his country would surrender unconditionally and that he had told its army to lay down its arms. Here from Saigon Radio Hookup is Laurie's report on the surrender.
In the words of General Minh, we are here to hand over the power of government to you in order to avoid bloodshed.
I remained in Saigon for 25 days as the communists set up their new regime and tightened their control. In the back of my mind, I thought there might be ways that Sok San could make it to Vietnam. Several thousand Khmer had fled across the Vietnamese border from eastern Cambodia. Well, so much for my little sampler of a remarkable time 40 to 50 years ago. The book goes on to tell my story of how I eventually managed to get Sanan out of Cambodia, and we managed to get her to America in 1980. So there you have a little sampler, David, of what I was doing all those years ago, and I'm happy to discuss anything that you guys would like to discuss regarding the book, about Vietnam, Cambodia history, or anything in between.
Well, great, Jim. That's just terrific. Before we open it up momentarily to questions, I have just a few of my own, having lived through at least some of that on the Cambodian end. I never did get to Saigon, where I was supposed to take up my position as a correspondent for the Times. I just never made it there. My bags made it there, and I actually spent 6 months in total immersion Vietnamese in New York, thanks to the Times, and learned it pretty well, but I never made it to Saigon. At any rate, first, I remember those final fraught days in Cambodia. I also remember a number of my Khmer friends who would say, much to their regret later, I suspect, if only the war can be over, no matter who wins, we're all Khmer and we can live together as Khmer. So did you ever consider not getting on that helicopter and staying on with my colleague Sid Schanberg, John Swain from the Times of London, and the gang on the in the French embassy? I'm not sure there was any TV or radio guy there actually in that embassy, but did you ever consider that, and maybe perhaps taking Sok San into the embassy with you then, and eventually out of the country?
There is I mean, the answer is that I did think about it, didn't think about it until I discovered that I could not find her on the morning when we were supposed to meet and go to the embassy, take the helicopters. But I was in a quandary, and any of you who have worked in journalism can appreciate this quandary. I was the only correspondent there for NBC. There was nobody else to cover the story. So story, personal issue, story, personal issue. So I left. Of course, I didn't know when I left that there would be absolutely no way that I could get her out in the next few days. For example, when I got to Bangkok, there were still efforts, and Sid Schanberg actually wrote about this in the New York Times. There were still efforts to get a plane back into Cambodia, to get people out. Because what was remarkable to me was that from the 12th to the 17th, the Khmer Republic soldiers kept fighting. But you raise another issue, David, which I think is very interesting. The difference between the Khmer and the Vietnamese in their attitude towards the inevitable collapse of their countries and the inevitable communist takeovers in each country. The Vietnamese, being very much aware of war and what was happening, and having been at it for so much longer than the Khmer, at the very last minute, everybody panicked. Hundreds of thousands tried to get out. You have seen those scenes, those famous scenes of people desperate to get out. On the other hand, the Khmer had this very shocking, in my view, sense of fatalism, that they would be able to work something out. And I was on those helicopters on the 12th, watching the children and adults around the schoolyard surrounding the helicopter evacuation, and nobody made any attempt to get on those helicopters. Furthermore, people who had been invited to go on the helicopters refused. So there were, at least by my count, 100 seats empty on the various helicopters that left Cambodia on that day, April 12th, 1975. So it was an extraordinary difference in character, I guess, or fatalism on the part of the Khmer versus the Vietnamese.
Right. No, there's no question about that. And I still recall, in fact, I was on the other end in Thailand by that point, waiting for Shanberg at the bridge at Aranya Prathet into Cambodia for the convoys to show up with the various people on board, including Shanberg and some of his colleagues. So I really remember that quite vividly. The one thing that we never really got a sense of then, and look, I was at one point I was surrounded by Khmer Rouge troops out in the down Highway 1 one morning, which was pretty frightening. But I was with some Lon Nol soldiers, and they got us, finally fought their way out, and we got free, thank God. Although I did have a good friend, Kate Webb, who was in fact taken prisoner by the Khmer Rouge, and that was not fun. She was never really right again after that. But you actually walked in the killing fields. You walked across these fields of bones and skeletons and skulls. And what was that like? What did that feel like to you when you did that?
Well, I should say that from 1975 to 1979, I made concerted efforts to get back both to Vietnam and Cambodia, and I couldn't get in. Obviously, Cambodia was a very, very special case. As you know, there was only one Western journalism team that went into Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge Pol Pot regime, and that was one where Liz Becker was part of that group of three people that went in. But other than that, it was almost impossible to gain access to Khmer Rouge Cambodia. I think a Yugoslavian TV team went in and a few from Eastern Europe at the time, but it was pretty much cut off from the outside world. The opportunity for me to return to Cambodia came in 1979, following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in January of that year, which overthrew the Pol Pot regime. And within 2 months, I was able to get a visa from the Vietnamese, and they took me into Cambodia for the first time since the war in April of 1979. At that time, I was trying still, in addition to reporting, trying to find Sinan. I had nothing from her by 1979, April, but I tried, asked everybody I could find, was there any trace of her? I had assumed.
Now, don't give everything away that's in the book, though, Jim.
Okay, but I'd assumed that she had perished, but I won't go into all the details because her story is just a remarkable one that all of you who haven't read it need to read. But in 79, and this was not only 79, but for years afterwards, the Cambodians kept the areas where people had been killed or executed, sort of open areas. There were, by one count, 196 killing fields spread across Cambodia, 196 locations. As late as 2007, 2005 it was, I took a little boat out into the middle of the Basak River, where there had been a execution center. And there was a little temple, and there were the skeletal remains of at least 1,000 people. And these kind of little pockets, if you will, of skeletal remains were all across the country. And we had a remarkable period of travel for 2 months later in 1979, going into early 1980, in which we traveled all across the country. And walking through these areas was really very, very disturbing. In some cases, there were some killing fields where the clothing of people were still, the remnants of clothing were still with the skeletal remains of those who had died. It was absolutely horrifying.
Okay, now given all of that, how do you think so many of the Khmer Rouge leadership effectively came to survive and actually become members, even in some cases today, of today's Cambodian government? How did they get past that? And how did the people accept the fact that they would be effectively back in power today?
Well, there are two factors here, David. First of all, the there were a group of Khmer, usually in the eastern part of the country, who by 1978 had defected to the Vietnamese. What is happening in Cambodia at this time is a split within the Communist Party. You had the more moderates, if you will, in a place where there was no moderation at all, but you had a split pro-Vietnamese, very much anti-Vietnamese, pro-Pol Pot. And those that sided with the Vietnamese then were taken in by the Vietnamese and retrained. People like the present prime minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen, whereas he was a soldier in the Khmer Rouge. He was taken in by the Vietnamese, flown up to Hanoi, given indoctrination by the Communist Party in Vietnam, and put back, placed in as, if you will, the Vietnamese puppet in Phnom Penh in 79. Hang Sam Ren, another man who's still in the Khmer government today, was a similar case. He was actually a commander, one of those commanding forces going into Phnom Penh in 75. And he was, again, taken, trained by the Vietnamese, sent back in.
But do you think they have any remorse at all for their horrific actions that they and their colleagues would take?
They certainly have covered it up. I mean, Hun Sen has been interviewed on the subject, and he usually says things like, he recognized the evil of Pol Pot, and that is why he joined the Vietnamese to overthrow this cruel and inhumane regime. Interestingly, I met Hun Sen for the first time in 1979. He was the 26-year-old foreign minister of Vietnamese occupied Cambodia. And I thought, which tells you a lot about my ability to judge people, I thought that he was certainly a puppet of Vietnam, a little scrawny guy. He had lost one eye in the war. He had a rather misfitting artificial eye. And I thought, this guy's going nowhere. Well, he became the prime minister of Cambodia. He's now the longest reigning strongman in Asia, still ruling after well over 35 years. So it's extraordinary that he has had this ability to stay in there. So now there's another aspect to this, of course, and that is the people of Cambodia went back to living, in many cases, with the Khmer Rouge who had been their prisoners. And when I visited Cambodia after the war, there were extraordinary cases of people who had been victimized. They survived, obviously, but they've been victimized, living right next door to people who had been their prisoner, their prison guards.
They're tormentors, basically.
They're tormentors, exactly. So you have this dynamic. The other part about the Cambodian legacy story is I don't know of any place in the world where it took so long to put together war crimes trials.
That would be my next question. Do you think the world should have held them more to account? And that'll be my last question, and then we can go on to everybody else. So
okay, well, on that point, from 1997, they began preparations for a war crime trial. Finally, they put it together. Something called the Extraordinary Chambers Court of Cambodia was put together, and they began in 2009, 2010.
But this is a Cambodian trial.
To try people. This is a Cambodian United Nations Tribunal, UN/Cambodia Tribunal. And they finally put on trial. They ended up putting on trial only 9 senior leaders. 6 of them were truly senior leaders. The first person to be convicted was the man who was in charge of the largest concentration prison camp, the Tul Sling prison in Phnom Penh. He was sentenced to life. All of them now have died, except for one guy, Khieu Samphan, who was ranking number 3 in the Communist Party leadership, is still alive at 89 years of age and still in prison. But that was an extraordinary and very limited, I should say, prosecution of those guilty of genocide in Cambodia. Now, to your question, should we have held them more accountable? The issue was everybody and nobody was accountable. Nobody seemed to have the appetite. You had the Chinese who were culpable. You had the Americans who were culpable. You had the Vietnamese. You had nobody who really had clean hands on this.
Well, you
So
had the International Criminal Court, but which is in theory, but anyway.
yes, but you need to put together that. You
Yes.
need to have the backing of big powers.
Right.
And who is going to back it? Well, it did happen, but it took a very, very long time. But my own personal opinion is that you have so many people, so many nations that were involved in the Cambodian story that were sharing guilt,
Yeah.
that there was very, very little room for a clear cut resolution of what was a pretty horrible
Very true.
period of genocide.
Jim, I think now it's time to open up to our very patient auditors and listeners to your questions. So we don't have a raise hand thing at the bottom, I see, but we do have a chat. So why don't we just say you put your name in the
David,
chat?
I have a question. David, may I ask a question?
And I'm sorry, and Chad was going to call on you, but Bill, go ahead. You're the first.
So, Jim, I've read most of your book, haven't done it all yet. What a remarkable job in pulling together the different pieces of the story, all the drama. It's remarkable. One of the things we're trying to do is make our experiences, as all of us are getting on in years, make our experiences relevant to the ones who come after us. And so I'm curious what your opinions or feelings would be about what were the Americans thinking as they looked at what was going on in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. It was obviously an impossible situation from very early on. How did they justify, in your opinion, do you have any insights on how did the Americans justify their continued involvement? It reminds me of what's going on in Afghanistan today. And would you agree? Are there any parallels in the way we get involved in unwinnable wars? Are there any parallels at all?
I think there are parallels with Afghanistan, and one of them is there has not been in Afghanistan, and there was not in Vietnam and Cambodia, a clear exit strategy. You get in, you get stuck, it goes on and on for years. The tragedy of Cambodia, of course, was that Cambodia was an expendable, and Willie Shawcross wrote a book with this title, an expendable sideshow to the Vietnam War. And there was very little thought as to the end game, what was going to come out of this Cambodian invasion, which began in 1970. So you have a situation where the Sihanouk is overthrown, a pliable government, a very weak government, comes in under a man named Lon Nol. The Americans come sweeping in, and yet after 5 years of terrible war, the Americans pull out. And they have taken a country which had maintained neutrality for most of the Vietnam War, and they've plunged it into a situation far worse than it ever would have been. And of course, one can never say, right, the Americans had no possible way of knowing that the Khmer Rouge, the most radical communists imaginable, could have come to power. But these were Maoists who had taken their inspiration from Mao Zedong and from the Cultural Revolution. The Khmer Rouge effort to return the country to, as they put it, year zero, was modeled very much after the Cultural Revolution in China. Now, one cannot predict these kind of things, but the fact that Cambodia was dragged into the war mainly because of a strategy that Richard Nixon had to get American troops out of Vietnam was one of the greatest tragedies, in my view, that we have had in terms of American involvement, in military involvement overseas. What are the lessons of this? Afghanistan, again, we got into a situation where we're propping up a government under tremendous pressure, and we have to do it for a very long period of time. What happens now? I suspect that the government in Kabul will not survive all that much longer, just as the governments of South Vietnam and Cambodia did not survive much longer after the Americans inevitably withdrew their assistance.
Well, I have one other thought about that. Was a very good question, by the way, and very pertinent. I thought that one of the principal differences between Afghanistan and either Cambodia or Vietnam is that, strangely, neither the Cambodians nor the Vietnamese ever tried to take their fight to the United States, to the American shore, to America. They could easily have done that. They could have sailed a small boat into San Francisco with a huge bomb on it and placed it under the Golden Gate Bridge, but they never did. And in Afghanistan, we have had, and the reason we went in there was an existential threat to the United States and Americans at home, in the home country. And if, in fact, we get out and get out too precipitously and the Taliban come back in, we could be faced with the same thing again and be forced to commit another 100,000 people to get the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which is still their allies, back in. So at any rate, that's just a personal feeling about that. And that may be a difference between Afghanistan and Cambodia, Vietnam. Do we have someone else? Since we don't have so many few people, we don't have to go over that.
Yes, Dave.
Okay, Alan.
David,
Okay.
hi, I'm in the car. Jim, this is terrific. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I hear you fine. Go ahead.
We hear
Go
you.
ahead.
So here's my question. Do you blame the French intellectuals for the development of the ideology that led to Pol Pot and his brethren?
Well, I mean, I don't actually, because I think that the Khmer Rouge modeled themselves much more on China. Yes, they all spent some time in Paris. They were all educated to a certain degree. Pol Pot himself did electrical engineering in Paris, so he was not doing very much. He wasn't all that. The ideological person, the most educated person, was the only one that's still alive, Khieu Samphan. He was actually a Marxist specialist in the Marxist economy and agricultural issues. So he was perhaps the only person among the Khmer Rouge that had, shall we say, some intellectual chops. But generally speaking, the Khmer Rouge modeled themselves on China, and they were very Maoist. In fact, Pol Pot, Salat Sar was his real name, went up to Beijing a number of times and met with Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong congratulated him on doing what Mao said that he had failed to do, and that is truly bring the nation back to its true Marxist socialist roots. So I don't see France playing all that great, except it is interesting. All the top leadership did have some education in France. In fact, many of them were very embittered by their experience in France and came back very, very disgruntled. But these were largely people who were in the shadows. When I was in Phnom Penh in the early 70s, we didn't know any of these characters. They were essentially unknown. Khieu Samphan was the only one that was known to the intelligentsia of Phnom Penh in the early 1970s.
I'll tell you something interesting about that, Jim. On my way into Phnom Penh, I stopped in Paris for about a week, and I got to know the Le Monde editor who was in charge of all of their Indochina coverage. He showed me a copy of the thesis that Khieu Samphan had written at the Université de Paris, setting out the entire outline of the pastoral economy that he believed the model that Cambodia needed to follow. It was the exact model, down to the killing of every intellectual, eliminating the entire class of intellectuals and capitalists and so on. That was finally followed by the Khmer Rouge when they came to power. It was quite extraordinary. And this was in the end of 1974. He showed.
Yes, I actually have that. I have that document right behind me here. It doesn't specifically call for the killing of people,
Right, well,
but it does outline a extreme agrarian socialist policy, and he was, if you will, the prime ideologue of the Khmer Rouge government.
absolutely. So who else? Next up.
We have John Giannini with a question, and I'm just unmuting you now, John. You may have to press a button. There you go.
Yep.
Hi, John.
Hey, hi, Jim.
Good.
Good to see you, even 8 months late from when we were supposed to see each other in
Vietnam.
Hue.
That's right, in Hue. That's exactly.
And so I'm kind of curious whether you've been in touch about going back and what the situation is for travel these days. I still have hopes of getting in to shoot the documentary I was supposed to shoot in April, but the area of Quang Tri province has been hammered by a typhoon recently, which unearthed a few unexploded 500-pound bombs. But
That's right.
I'm just curious if you've got any updates on getting in. And secondly, my second question is regarding the overthrow of King Sihanouk, or Prince Sihanouk at the time. I was involved in, as a soldier, combat photographer of the 11th Cav. I was involved for 6 months prior to the invasion of opening all the routes to Snool. And then when my second tour, a couple of months later, my tour ended the day Sihanouk was overthrown, and then my second tour started in June. And all I did during those days was talk to people from Cambodia, basically.
Wow.
Anyway, I'm just wondering, how much involvement did you believe the US government had in ginning up the situation to overthrow Sihanouk?
Let me go back to your first question first. Going back to Vietnam, if you can get back and you're willing to go through 2 weeks quarantine in a facility that the Vietnamese government chooses for you, which is not very comfortable and perhaps more like the barracks that you experienced when you were in the military, you can do that. But it's they're being obviously very, very careful in Vietnam, and they've done very well in terms of keeping the coronavirus.
They lost more
numbers
people in
way
the
down.
typhoon.
More people in the typhoon than they have to than are hospitalized with coronavirus. I was supposed to be back in Vietnam at this very time, and obviously I'm not. I was last there in last year, and I'm hoping to get back as soon as I can. But I think that it's very very difficult at the moment, unless getting the visa is difficult. Once you get the visa, then you have to agree to go to, basically they have set up these camps, which are more like military camps, as I understand it, for quarantine for 2 weeks before then you can go and lead a relatively normal life in Vietnam. I'm hoping to get back later in the new year. I'm determined to get back to Vietnam.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the same thing, but what I had heard was that they were only allowing foreign experts, and my visa with the information department there was on my American passport. I don't usually use that, but so I said, well, can I use my Italian passport and go in as a foreign expert then? And I'm still waiting for an answer.
Right.
We have 4 more questions and 15 minutes. So
okay, let me just very quickly just would you repeat that last part about Sihanouk and
yeah, I was just wondering how much involvement the US had in facilitating things for the overthrow of Sihanouk, because I know for sure, because I was there were 6 months of operations to open the border.
Well, if you can believe the transcripts from the White House that were released by the Nixon administration, Nixon seemed genuinely surprised by the overthrow of Sihanouk. There had been speculation about CIA involvement with Sirach Matak. Sirach Matak was one of the coup leaders along with Lon Nol. He did have a meeting at the US Embassy in Bangkok prior to the coup, but I have not been able to find concrete evidence of direct American involvement in the coup d'etat that overthrew Sihanouk. Sihanouk does write a book. He wrote a book called My War with the CIA, in which he alleges that it was all a CIA plot against him. But it's really hard to pin down after all these years. So that's the short answer to your question there.
Mhm. Thank you.
David.
All right. Next up, we have Dom Levine with.
Hi, Don. How you doing?
Hey, Jim. Great to see you from here in Singapore.
Great. How are things?
Good, good. Look forward to catching up when you get back out to the region.
Absolutely.
Just two quick questions. The first one is, did the Cambodians generally, what was the reaction when the Americans pulled out? Did they expect that they would pull out, or was there a sense of kind of shock and disbelief? Did they feel that they would, the Americans would stay to kind of help them against the Khmer Rouge? And then secondly, from your, I guess living there in Cambodia, it was obviously difficult through the fog of war to see what was happening, but kind of looking back now, is there something that you would have done differently, looking back with age and wisdom?
I'll take the second question first. I was so very much personally involved with a particular woman in Cambodia, and I had to do it all over again. Obviously, I would have got her out and forced her to leave much, much earlier. It's all in the book why it was so complicated. She obviously had great ties to family and friends in her life in Cambodia. There was an unwillingness to believe, particularly among urban Khmer, of how bad things were. I think that if you lived in Phnom Penh, at least for much of the 5 years between 70 and 75, you could live still a reasonable life. I remember meeting the famous Khmer dancer, Popa Devi, who died only a few months ago. And she just seemed to be totally unaware of what was going on in the countryside outside of Phnom Penh. So obviously, had I to do over again, I would have made sure that the particular person that I was involved with got out. Interestingly, the Khmer were, on the one hand, very fatalistic at the end. On the other hand, they certainly felt betrayed. I've put in the book the letter of Sirak Matak, who was one of the coup leaders in 1970 and who was there in 75 and who was executed by the Khmer Rouge, and his very, very moving letter to Ambassador John Gunther Dean. And the letter basically says that he never expected that the Americans would just get up and leave and betray the Khmer people in the horrid way that they did. So there was among the intellectuals, I think, a great sense of betrayal. Among many people, it's incredible Khmer fatalism, which, again, nobody rushed the helicopters. There's an interesting story about the military attaché there, who I was hoping would join us on this call, but Alan Armstrong was not available for this call. Alan was very worried about the U.S. Marines coming in with the helicopter evacuation the April the 12th. He was very worried that there could be some violence, that the Marines would be very nervous, would open fire. And he assured that he assured the ambassador and he assured the military command that he knew the Cambodians and there'd be no attempt to rush the helicopters. Therefore, the ambassador asked, and the U.S. command agreed, to take the bullets out of all the M16 rifles of all the U.S. Marines that secured the airfield, the schoolyard that you saw for that evacuation. And in fact, the men that secured that airfield had empty magazines in their M16. So it was this extraordinary fatalism about the Khmer that I think was the prevailing mood at the time. Dom.
Thanks, Jim.
All right. Next up, we have a question from Jerry Morse.
Hi, Jerry.
Hello, Jim. How you doing?
Very well, sir.
You remember back our days in classical high school?
My goodness, yes, indeed. But you've changed. You've changed.
A little bit. You too. The book was absolutely riveting. I felt like I was with both you and Saksanan experiencing what you experienced. And that leads me to two questions. First, where did the first person narrative covering Soxanon's years in captivity come from? I can't imagine she could have kept the diary. And second, why didn't Walter Teague join you on the trip back with her ashes?
Okay. First of all, let me just summarize very, very quickly. Walter Teague was her partner for the last 25 years of her life after she got to America. So that's who Walter Teague was. He could not bring himself, for a number of reasons, physical reasons. He's a good deal older than I am. For a number, he just could not go back to Cambodia. And he knew that I had brought her out of Cambodia. He said, "Listen, it should be full circle. It should be you that take her back to Cambodia." Those of you who don't know what I'm saying here have to read the book. So, but in any event, that's the answer to that part of the question. And would you repeat the first question that you asked?
Well, I'm looking at when you go to her time in captivity, there's a lot of first person narrative, and I don't see how she could do that without finding some source.
When she came, when I got her to America in 1980, she and I sat down and we had hoped to do a book about her experiences way back in 1980, 81. For a number of reasons, it never happened. But she took, and I sat with her, and we went over a lot of material. And she actually sat down and wrote enormous amounts of material. I think in the preface, I do talk about the work that she did and the story of Jackie Shannon, who is a friend of mine who worked with her on the initial recollections, the initial memories, and it all came together. Now, I have taken her rough draft of her story, and I have obviously rewritten it, but have tried to keep it as faithful to the original as I could.
She had to have had an incredible memory because it really felt like you were there.
Well, I think if you're in that situation, 4 years essentially in a Khmer Rouge prison, if you will, a prison, as she put it, a prison without walls. I think your mind is pretty concentrated on the horrors that you have seen. And she was a very, very smart woman in so many ways, and I feel blessed to have even spent a small part of her. I spent part of her life with me.
Thanks, Jim. Good to see you.
Okay.
Good to see you. We'll talk later.
Yeah.
We have Gordon. Oh, go ahead.
Is my sound on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Just one comment, Jim. We are fellow victims of le mal jaune, as the French called it. In your case, at least 2 Indo-Chinese women in your life. In mine, I spent my first posting in Vietnam, the International Control Commission, dividing my time between Saigon and Hanoi. And then later with an accreditation from Thailand, and then later still as ambassador to Cambodia for the last 4 years of the last decade. And but after Vietnam, of course, I was cross-posted to my prize was a cross-posting to Japan, where I met and married a Japanese lady who is still with me, thank goodness.
Great, fantastic.
But loved the book. I don't think I would have loved you at the time.
No,
given, you know, the circumstances. But like you, I fell in love with Vietnam, and probably more so Cambodia. I kept managing in my 4 years from 95 to 99 to keep extending, because there's going to be an election, and because this is happening and that is happening. And I had pretty good relationship with Sihanouk, and also Hun Sen, of all things. Hun Sen, a lot of people don't realize, is quite brilliant. You met him when he was youngest foreign minister in the world, I guess. But you know, in spite of the long record that he has managed to more or less democratically stay in power. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? And he's a remarkable guy. When I first met him, when I first called on him, he was way more briefed and way more savvy and asked all the good questions that his partner, Prince Ranarid, could not. So, a very impressive guy. So but the remarkable changes that have happened in that area since we were first there. Unbelievable. Saigon is unfortunately just another Southeast Asian capitalist city now.
Well, Phnom Penh is catching up very fast. It's with all the Chinese skyscrapers that are going up. It's a city that is not the city that you and I knew.
It sure isn't.
Years ago. What year you were ambassador to in Phnom Penh from what year to what year?
95 to 99.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're calling in from Vancouver.
I'm calling in from Vancouver.
Excellent.
Okay, next and final person with the hand up. Edie Lederer, the Associated Press.
Hey, Edie, good to see you after all these years.
Great to see you, Jim. And I look forward to reading the book. I am told that there's a growing appetite in Hollywood and in TV circles for Vietnam stories. Is this something that you're pursuing? And I had a second thought. Since Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States, he certainly grew up in the Vietnam War era, and yet I personally don't remember reading anything about him during the war. Do you?
I don't actually know how he escaped military service. Perhaps somebody else knows, but he did not do military service. I don't think it was bone spur in the case of another particular president, but he didn't. He did not serve. As in terms of Hollywood, Edie, if you have any contacts out there, let me know. No, I really don't know if there's any Hollywood future to my book. Read it first, and then let me know if you think it does have any potential.
Well, that is an excellent, in fact, conclusion for me to end on, because that's very, very true. I want to urge all of you who have not read it, by all means, buy it and read it. It's I read it in Kindle. It's also in paperback. I can tell you it is. I have not seen the paperback, but I can tell you on Kindle it is fabulous. They even have the parts that Jim's lady friend wrote or talked about in blue to distinguish from him, so you can tell it's the white and the blue, and the blue and the white. So it's really a compelling book. And Jim, thank you so much for an amazing stroll down history's lane. I mean, it brings back so many thoughts and feelings of my own.
Thank you, David. And if any of you who are on the call want to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. Okay. I'm sure you can get all the details from OPC, and we can stay in touch. I appreciate all of you turning up for this, and sorry we couldn't do it in person and raise a glass, but we'll do that the next time.
Well, and the other thing I should ask all of you to do is, if you have read it, or when you do read it, put a note on Kindle and say how wonderful it is, so that people can read about it. And if you have any other place to review it outside of Amazon, or rather on Amazon's website, please write about it, tell all your friends, and it's worth reading. Really
good to see you all. Lovely to see you all. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Join the OPC if you're not members.